Hi readers, we're back. I'm very excited to keep reading. Hope you guys all had a great kind of spring break with all the fun activities. But now we are back into academics, which is really exciting because we get to continue Number the Stars. I left off at a really kind of exciting, interesting part. They were having a wake for Great Aunt Bert, even though as readers we know that there is no Great Aunt Bert. And Peter is here, and we know that Ellen's parents have just arrived. So a lot of stuff going on, and chapter 10, which I'm going to read in a second, is called Let Us Open the Casket. Okay? So really quick, before I read this chapter, I really want to teach you guys that when you're reading a story, usually most readers will pay attention to the main characters, right? Like we say, who's the main character of the story? Why are they important? Today we're actually going to be focusing on minor characters. Minor characters also play an important role. So I want us to think about this question while I'm reading today, and then also when you're reading your book on Epic or an independent reading book you have at home. So the question is, who is a minor character in the story? Why is his or her role important? So I'm going to be reading about what happens next in the story, but I want you to be thinking about minor characters and an important role that they have, okay? So, chapter 10 of Number of the Stars. Let us open the casket. You are all here now, Uncle Henrik said, looking around the living room. I must go. Anne-Marie stood in the wide doorway, looking in from the hall. The baby slept now, and its mother looked tired. Her husband sat beside her, his arm across her shoulders. The old man's head was still bent. Peter sat alone, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It was clear that he was deep in thought. On the sofa, Ellen sat between her parents, one hand clasped tightly in her mother's. She looked up at Anne-Marie but didn't smile. Anne-Marie felt a surge of sadness. The bond of their friendship had not broken, but it was as if Ellen had moved now into a different world, the world of her own family and whatever lay ahead for them. The elderly bearded man looked up suddenly as Uncle Henrik prepared to go. God keep you safe, he said, in a firm but quiet voice. Henrik nodded. God keep us all safe, he replied. Then he turned and left the room. A moment later, Anne-Marie heard him leave the house. Mama brought the teapot from the kitchen and a tray of cups. Anne-Marie helped her pass the cups around. No one spoke. Anne-Marie, Mama whispered to her in the hall, you may go to bed if you want to. It is very late. Anne-Marie shook her head, but she was tired, and she could see that Ellen was too. Her friend's head was leaning on her mother's shoulder, and her eyes closed now and then. Finally, Anne-Marie went to the empty rocking chair in the corner of the living room and curled there with her head against its soft, padded back. She dozed. She was startled from her half-sleep by the sudden sweep of headlights through the sheer curtains and across the room as a car pulled up outside. The car door slammed. Everyone in the room tensed, but no one spoke. She heard, as if in a recurring nightmare, the pounding on the door, and then the heavy, frighteningly familiar staccato of boots on the kitchen floor. The woman with the baby gasped and began suddenly to weep. The male, accented voice from the kitchen was loud. We have observed, he said, that an unusual number of people have gathered at this house tonight. What is the explanation? There has been a death, Mama's voice replied calmly. It is always our custom to gather and pay our respects when a family member dies. I am sure you are familiar with our customs. One of the officers pushed Mama ahead of him from the kitchen and entered the living room. There were others behind him. They filled the wide doorway. As always, their boots gleamed. Their guns, their helmets, all of them gleamed in the candlelight. Anne-Marie watched as the man's eyes moved around the room. He looked for a long time at the casket. Then he moved his gaze, focusing on each person in turn. When his eyes reached her, she looked back at him steadily. Who died? He asked harshly. No one answered. They watched Anne-Marie, and she realized that the officer was directing the question at her. Now she knew for certain what Uncle Henrik had meant when he had talked to her in the barn. To be brave came more easily if you knew nothing. She swallowed. My great-aunt Bert, she lied in a firm voice. The officer moved forward suddenly across the room to the casket. He placed one gloved hand on its lid. Oh, poor great-aunt Bert, he said in a condescending voice. I do know your customs, he said, turning his gaze toward Mama, who still stood in the doorway. And I know it is custom to pay one's respects by looking your loved one in the face. It seems odd to me that you have closed this coffin up so tightly. His hand was in a fist, and he rubbed it across the edge of the polished lid. Why is it not open? He demanded. Let us open it up and take one last look at Great-Aunt Bert. Anne-Marie saw Peter across the room stiffen in his chair, lift his chin, and reach slowly with one hand toward his side. I'm going to stop here for a second. Remember, there is no Great-Aunt Bert, so we can kind of infer that the casket is empty, and here the soldier is wanting to open it. What do you think is going to happen? Make some predictions. Tell someone near you, tell your parent, tell your sibling. What do you think is going to happen? Okay, everyone has their prediction? Mama walked quickly across the room, directly to the casket, directly to the officer. You're right, she said. The doctor said it should be closed because Aunt Bert died of typhus, and he said that there was a chance germs would still be there and they could be dangerous. But what does he know? Only a country doctor, and an old man at that. Surely typhus germs wouldn't linger in a dead person. And dear Aunt Bert, I have been longing to see her face, to kiss her goodbye. Of course we will open the casket. I am glad you suggested. With a swift motion, the Nazi officer slapped Mama across her face. She staggered backward, and a white mark on her cheek darkened. You foolish woman, he spat. To think that we would have any interest in seeing a body of your diseased aunt. Open it after we leave, he said. This just goes along with, we've been researching how the Nazi soldiers were really, really harsh. So that's one example there. With one gloved thumb, he pressed a candle flame into darkness. The hot wax spattered the table. Put all these candles out, he said, or pull the curtains. Then he strode to the doorway and left the room. Motionless, silent, one hand to her cheek, Mama listened. They all listened as the uniformed men left the house. In a moment, they heard the car doors, the sound of its engine, and finally, they heard it drive away. Mama, Anne-Marie cried. Her mother shook her head quickly and glanced at the open window covered only by the sheer curtain. Anne-Marie understood. There might still be soldiers outside, watching, listening. Peter stood and drew the dark curtains across the windows. He relit the extinguished candle. Then he reached for the old Bible that had always been there on the mantel. He opened it quickly and said, I will read a psalm. His eyes turned to the page he had opened at random, and he began to read in a strong voice. Oh, praise the Lord! How good it is to sing psalms to our God! How pleasant to praise him! The Lord is rebuilding Jerusalem. He gathers in the scattered sons of Israel. It is he who heals the broken in spirit and binds up their wounds. He who numbers the stars one by one. Mama sat down and listened. Gradually, they each began to relax. Anne-Marie could see the old man across the room moving his lips as Peter read. He knew the ancient psalm by heart. Anne-Marie didn't. The words were unfamiliar to her. And she tried to listen, tried to understand, tried to forget the war and the Nazis, tried not to cry, tried to be brave. The night breeze moved the dark curtains at the open windows. Outside, she knew, the sky was speckled with stars. How could anyone number them one by one, as the psalm said? There were too many. The sky was too big. Ellen had said that her mother was frightened of the ocean, that it was too cold and too big. The sky was too, thought Anne-Marie. The whole world was. Too cold, too big, and too cruel. Peter read on in his firm voice, though it was clear he was tired. The long minutes passed. They seemed hours. Finally, still reading, he moved quietly to the window. He closed the Bible and listened to the quiet night. Then he looked around the room. Now, he said, it is time. First, he closed the windows, then went to the casket and opened the lid. And that is the end of chapter 10. Okay? So, it's getting really interesting. That was a bit scary, very scary when the Nazi soldiers were there. But wow, wasn't Mama so smart making up that disease that the great aunt Bert had? I was so impressed by that. So wow, I want to kind of just go back to our question for a second. The minor character I want to talk to you guys about is Peter. Peter has been mentioned a few times. He's been here and there throughout the story, but he's definitely not a main character. But man, does he play a major role. He is helping Ellen's family, and he doesn't even really know them that well. He's helping a bunch of those strangers. So I think now, readers, you've inferred that the strangers in the living room are also Jewish people, and we can gather that Peter is helping them in some way. So even though Peter is a minor character, he plays a really important role because he's helping the main character, and he's helping them hopefully get their freedom. So we'll see. We're going to have to keep reading. So what I want you guys to do, and I'll put this in the directions, I want you guys, after reading your 2 steps, to pick one of your minor characters. Focus on a character that's not a major or main character. And I want you to write about your minor character, just a couple sentences, about what role they play in your story and why they're important. So I'm going to have you guys answer this question. I'll write it in the assignment. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your minor characters. So, all right, guys, we'll read more tomorrow. Thank you, guys.